given enough time. Thank you for the alert. We are indeed recording this, but I want to jump right into things. I want to start by thanking everyone that's been able to come out today. The privacy convening that we're holding is but one of many that we hope to hold over the next few weeks and over the next few years as we continue to work to build a larger tent that incorporates other organizations and advocates into the intersectional fight to improve privacy for all. I also want to acknowledge that this event is made possible in part thanks to support from the Rose Foundation for Communities and the Environment. And we have an incredible panel of speakers today to admittedly go at a breakneck pace and talk about the ways that increasing surveillance is particularly impacting workers and working class and low-income communities. The ways that increasing surveillance and increasing technologies can contribute to the creation of, as Virginia Eubanks put it, digital poorhouses, and how that data is all too often funneled directly into law enforcement and policing environments to be wielded unequally and frequently racially against already over-policed communities. Today, we have harrowing stories of individuals in the communities that suffer at the hands of increasing surveillance, be that from consumer technologies to government or law enforcement overaction. What I especially hope these conversations illustrate, however, is the way that these issues are intrinsically and inherently intersectional. When we're talking about surveillance of workers, we are talking about the surveillance of students. When we are saying that these impacts are affecting low income and working class, it is or will be impacting all of us. And ignoring the way that any of these technologies are all too often funneled into law enforcement would be a gross disservice to the fight for justice and to ourselves. With that, I want to introduce our panelists that will be telling these stories today. Xavid Pretzer is a software engineer at Google's cloud load balancer team and a steward with the Alphabet Workers Union. They believe that by organizing together, workers can create a more equitable workplace and software that has a more positive impact on the world. In their free time, a person after my very own heart, they're a tabletop role-playing game designer and housing activist. And if anyone wants to play D&D, I'm sure you can find my email address. Gabriela Sandoval is Director of Race and Equity Policy for the Utility Reform Network down the street from PRC's office in San Diego. She'll be joined by Chi-Chi Wu from the National Consumer Law Center. Chi-Chi is a staff attorney at NCLC focusing on consumer credit issues, including legislative, administrative, and other advocacy. Chi-Chi's specialties include fair credit reporting, credit cards, refund application loans, and medical debt. Brendan McQuade is Associate Professor in the Criminology Department at the University of Southern Maine and author of Pacifying the Homeland, Intelligence Fusion and Mass Supervision. In addition to his academic research, he's written op-eds for the Portland Press Herald and Bangor Daily News about police surveillance and advised city councilors and state representatives on these issues. As a scholar activist, Brendan is committed to thinking with social movements. He's currently working on 2 reports with social movement organizations, one on Boston's gang database with Muslim Justice League, and another on corporate surveillance of property crime with Interrupting Criminalization. He's also a board member of the Visionary Organizing Lab and a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. And last, but certainly not least, Mitra Ebadolahi is the Senior Project Director for Economic Justice at Upturn, an organization that advances equity and justice in the design, governance, and use of technology. Prior to that, from 2011 to 2022, she was a litigator with the American Civil Liberties Union, first in New York and then in San Diego, where she co-created the Border Litigation Project to litigate civil rights abuses at the intersection of immigrants' rights, racial profiling, and police practices. So one quick last note on format. The first hour, we're going to have a moderated discussion with our panelists as they expand on these issues. But please feel free to use the Q&A function built into Zoom. You can also participate in the chat. We'll be monitoring, and during the last half hour of today, we'll be dedicating that time to a more loosey-goosey Q&A if there are questions. So with that, I want to jump right into the first topic of today, the issue of surveillance of labor. Xavid, let's kick it off. Obviously, in a post-COVID world, we have seen an explosion in the number of remote workers. You're looking at one yourself. I was hoping that you can just kick things off by talking about examples of the kinds of remote monitoring going on at Google or Alphabet that workers around the country are also experiencing.
Yes, thank you. I think everyone appreciates the value of modern technology and getting work done and enabling us to work when we aren't physically in the office, and there's a lot of advantages. But I think it's very easy for people to sort of underestimate the degree to which anything you do on a computer supplied by your employer may be monitored. And so, this gets applied differently in different circumstances. But things like just what documents you read, what calendars you look at, what time you're spending on and off the computer, that's all sort of being tracked invisibly to you, and you might not be aware of it or might not be concerned about it until your employer has some reason to be interested in potentially using that against you. And so and like the legal protections that that workers have for employer surveillance are pretty weak. And so that while there are some theoretical cases where it's theoretically not legal to surveil workers to discourage union organizing, for example, in practice it's very easy for your employer to say, well, we were actually surveilling you because we were worried you were going to leak documents or for some other reason that's not protected. And your ability to have any sort of positive outcome from the legal system in that sort of situation is practically non-existent. And so especially in an era where workers are both needing to organize to address working conditions concerns and then also ethical concerns about their work, it's very easy for surveillance to both, the fear of surveillance to have a chilling effect, and then also for actual surveillance to lead to real, material consequences, such as, when someone's being investigated, an employer might write a policy about, you should only read documents that you have a need to know. And then most of the time that's not going to be enforced because, if this document is available for me to read, then maybe I can assume that I've got a need to know it, or else it would be more locked down. But if your employer, has reason to, want to discourage, you're agitating around ethical concerns, or is another reason to want to get rid of you, then they can say, well, we can prove that you violated this policy. So, and then you have very little recourse in that sort of situation. So, so that, that sort of experience is one of the things that really galvanized me into union organizing and sort of highlighted that, trying to sort of advocate for the greater good as individuals can be very risky, because it's very easy for your employer to use all the resources they have to retaliate against you. So it's really important to build a movement that, that's a bunch of people working together and supporting each other that can potentially be most effective. And I guess the other aspect of this is I'm a full-time employee at Google. So, in some ways, while I'm aware that my activity is being surveilled, that's less likely to get used against me than people in other aspects. Alphabet also employs a large number of temps, vendor, contractor workers, and they don't necessarily have the same working conditions that full-time employees, and they are more actively surveillance. There's this idea of the of sort of quantifying data to sort of justify maybe what you want to do. So if you can do analytics and saying, okay, well, this person steps away from their computer more frequently or something, you can sort of manufacture a reason to retaliate or fire someone if you're just trying to reduce the workforce, or if you have some reason you don't want to write down that you think that we want to retaliate against this person. And for people that are in Alphabet's TVC workforce, they're much more surveilled and a much greater risk for having data being used against them in a way that they can't really effectively defend against. So I think both at Alphabet and many other organizations, that type of surveillance has become much more common in recent years, and it can mask a lot of bias and other things, and sort of with the idea that data is objective or just exploiting this power differential.
I think you hit on so many of the issues that I had hoped you would hit on, which the impact on labor. One of the things that I wanted to really draw out, though, is that we remote proctoring in schools, remote monitoring of workers isn't a wholly new concept, but there is it is a bit of a brave new world as far as the level of technologies that are being deployed. I would love for you to talk to some of the more extreme types of surveillance that I think that people might not assume or be aware of. I think that even to the level of like keyloggers, I think people are generally aware that, okay, if it's on your computer, if it's a work provided device, they might go as far as tracking every single keystroke that you press. But I'm not sure if people are aware of like the psychometric monitoring or the more sort of the ways that all of the different data points are then fed through. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily as much of an expert on some of the details of that as other people, so I'm not, I might not be able to talk about all of the details you might be interested in. But I think it is important to remember that it's not just what you type. It can be things like sort of using systems to analyze who seems to be paying attention in like a video meeting, analyzing that sort of data as well, and then also things that aren't tied to your specific work computer, things like video surveillance at an office, looking at when people are badging in, if people are badging in at unusual hours, or badging in and out more frequently. That sort of tracking as well can be used against workers without them necessarily without the employer having any disclosure of how this data is being used until maybe it's too late.
Going off of that same issue, what you talked about earlier, the difference between the kinds of surveillance that's happening in a white collar office with engineers versus the kind of surveillance that's happening to, say, contractor drivers or factory workers in Amazon. I'm wondering if you could speak not just to the differences in the type of surveillance that's happening and the level there, but what the similarities and differences are when it comes to organizing and the impact on the ability for labor to respond to these issues.
Yeah, I think that's a big question. I mean, I think so. As the Alphabet Workers Union is a union that is unionizing both full-time employees and this temp and contractor workforce. I think it's been really interesting to see sort of like the differences in experiences. I mean, definitely in terms of you end up with this two-tiered employment model where some workers sort of have more job security and sort of have this illusion or have this are able to sort of get away with worrying less about some of these things until maybe it's too late. Whereas for a lot of people who are working as temps or as contractors, it's sort of inescapable. You've got metrics, analyzing your importance, and you just don't have the same level, analyzing your effectiveness, I guess is maybe what I meant to say. Sort of on this very impersonal
heat mapping, turning workers into heat maps as opposed to necessarily judging their efficiency even.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. It's like you have these metrics that whoever sold you the software wants to call efficiency, but it's not actually necessarily measuring things. You're measuring perhaps the time you're spent in the chair or something. You're not necessarily it's a sort of a proxy, and and data is attracted to people who are like we want to be only keeping the best workers, so we want to be firing a certain percentage each quarter or something, and then so it's that sort of data can both create this false confidence that you actually know how to manage your workforce and put your workers sort of in this this environment where they don't have the job security. They're worried about the consequences, the risk of losing their job. And it's sort of interesting because in some ways, and obviously varies a lot from person to person, in some ways that might make people more reluctant to organize, and sometimes it actually makes people more willing. Like I've actually been impressed by people who sort of take the approach where I don't have the job security anyways. I might as well fight to improve my circumstance or fight for the person who's going to have this job after me, even if I lose my job. For example, temp workers know that they're not going to be able to work in this particular role for more than 2 years, and so if you know that the end of your ability to have this particular job is coming up, but maybe you want to fight for the person after you so they can have better, job security, better benefits, not be subject to the same sort of quantification and sort of treated just based on their metrics and not with respect to the person. And so I've actually been really impressed by that. And like, you definitely have things, on contrary, where full-time employees, sort of feel safe enough. It's like, they're sort of sympathetic in general, but they don't really see how some of these issues are, affecting them, or they're less willing to take risk. And it can be sort of often, take some more education for people who are in these less precarious positions at times, because they don't have the same personal experience. But I mean, I think it's actually been very, very valuable to have these sort of conversations, to sort of learn from each other's experiences, because I think there's a lot that these employees in different roles can learn from each other. And I think that's another thing that's been really interesting as a union that sort of went public and did a lot of the organizing during the remote period of COVID, is it's very easy when, their communication is all sort of primarily via your work computer, that really limits your ability to communicate with coworkers or people in different roles in a way that's not being surveilled or has the risk of being surveilled. And, sort of remove some of these traditional, water cooler conversations or conversations in the parking lot that can previously be good opportunities to agitate, to make connections and so on. And that's definitely been somewhat of a challenge. And at the same time, even in offices, Alphabet and other companies have been putting greater efforts to separate employees who are working on different aspects of the company, separate full-time employees from temps and contractors into different buildings or even different cities, to sort of make it more difficult for this sort of solidarity to happen, and to make, for example, full-time employees less aware that these other workers aren't being treated with the same level of respect.
Don't be evil. With that, I think we can move. I hope that we can return to this issue at the end of this conversation, but I want to move into talking to Gabriela and to Chichi about the issues of access to essential services and the lack of privacy there. I think there's a lot of overlap there. I think to kick things off, I would be remiss to not mention the absolutely incredible reporting coming out of the markup this week that found that internet service providers, these same providers that receive billions of dollars of government support, have routinely and systematically served sub-broadband speeds to low-income, and in 2/3 of the cases studied, predominantly Black and Brown communities, as opposed to the more affluent white communities, which are nearby. Gabriela, I was hoping that you might speak to to some of the ways that you've seen technology unequally distributed on the ground when it comes to infrastructure.
Absolutely. So I'm excited that you mentioned the article on markup, because we turned the Utility Reform Network. It's part of the Digital Equity Los Angeles Coalition that found a similar situation with Spectrum in the LA, well, actually in California in general, where they are providing lower speeds at the same prices to low-income communities as they are to, than they are to more affluent communities who are getting much higher quality, faster speeds in their internet service for the same price or less, actually, is what we found. So I'm excited you brought that up. But I also want to talk about some work that Turn did a few years ago. And, in the Utility Reform Network works in both the telecommunications space as well as the energy utility space. And in the early 2000s, the large investor-owned utility companies were transitioning to installing smart meters into, onto their customers' homes, so that they could, the idea was the kind of compelling, happy side of this technology was that people would be able to monitor their electricity usage and decrease their usage, right? Either because they might want to save money, or they want to make a positive environmental impact by using less energy.
is a whole issue to talk about the ways that greenwashing and privacy washing are intertwined and how that is interplaying with smart cities. Again, I would love to have a 3-day conference on these issues.
We should definitely do that soon in person. So, so I can see all your lovely faces in person. But yeah, absolutely. There's always this kind of happy, bright side to the use of the technology. And Turn was alarmed because we knew this kind of technology could likely be used to encroach upon the privacy of customers. And true enough, what we found between 2010 and 2020 was that thousands of requests from different federal and state agencies and law enforcement agencies were coming into the investor-owned utilities throughout the state.
Incredible.
But critically, in San Diego's service territory, San Diego Gas and Electric service territory, we found that even though that service territory is a fraction of the size of the larger IOUs, ICE was actually submitting thousands and thousands of subpoenas for customer data. So if you didn't think you were being surveilled by switching on the lights, you can be sure that this is a way that at least ICE was tracking when certain customers were home. Based on the patterns of our electricity usage, you can tell when people are running large appliances, with a certain amount of precision, you can tell what kinds of appliances people are using when they're home, when they're not home, you can establish patterns. So we were very alarmed that this was happening. And what we came to find out was that ICE was issuing internal subpoenas to themselves in order to be able to access this data. So in 2020, as you might remember, we had in California an abridged legislative session, but we were actually able to sponsor legislation that made it through to the governor's desk and to being passed that closed this loophole for utility customers. So ICE is no longer allowed to issue their own internal subpoenas. They actually have to go and stand in front of a judge and access, receive a kind of third-party granted access in order to gather this data from their customers. And I think one of the things two things that were really critical in our thinking here. One is that when you surveil people in this way by tracking their use of a basic human need, right? Because of the way that the physical environment has been established, there's no way around needing lights or needing heat or needing cooling, what have you. So by encroaching upon the privacy of people through a basic need that they might have in their home, we create a situation where people might just not establish service. And this isn't just unhealthy for the people living in a particular household who may not have electric service. It's also incredibly dangerous for their neighbors, right? Because if they're running, extension cords from their neighbors' homes in order to be able to charge phones, or if they're using other types of unsafe heating and lighting practices, then, we do know that these are a significant causes of fires and carbon monoxide poisoning, et cetera, in people's homes. And so it creates an unsafe situation for the household as well as for whole communities, for neighborhoods. The second thing that I think is really important is the role of data reporting in this, because if we hadn't thought in advance, hey, we're saturating California households with this new technology. And if we hadn't thought to require the utility companies to publish data on who was accessing that data, we never would have known. We never would have known that this was being used, as a kind of behind the scenes way for ICE and other law enforcement to monitor people. And so it was really a kind of a critical moment of understanding that every time we make these types of technological transitions, we really need to ensure that the corporations or whatever the entity is, right, is reporting on who has access to this data.
100%. I think I remember reading an article not around 2020 that I believe you might have been quoted in, that said that, somehow Chula Vista had become the most surveilled city in the country. There's the issue of where the technology is deployed and how it's deployed, I think is so enormous. Chichi, I want to change tracks only slightly. I mentioned Virginia Eubanks's amazing book, Automating Inequality, at the outset of the panel. In it, she wrote about the ways that families, often in some of the most vulnerable positions imaginable, are now, in most cases across the country, forced to use technologies that offer little, but that completely control their access to essential services. Paraphrasing her, I love this. She said that digital tracing and automated decision-making hide poverty from the professional middle class, give the nation an ethical distance it needs to make inhumane choices, and allows us to escape our shared responsibility to eradicate poverty. Now, that was written in 2018. I was wondering, Chichi, if you might speak to some of the ways that black box algorithms and machine learning, these completely opaque tools, are being deployed in the credit and consumer credit and credit reporting spaces. Again, another area of essential services we think of, maybe not in the same exact box as electricity, water, energy, internet, but that clearly is, if you expect to exist in the world, in the United States, you must have access to these services.
Oh, absolutely, Emery. And where do I begin to talk about that? I think I only have 5 or 10 minutes. Some of those of you who aren't familiar with National Consumer Law Center, we're a policy and advocacy shop that focuses on consumer law issues with an emphasis on low-income consumers. And I, in particular, work on credit reporting, consumer reporting, and companies that are governed by the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is, in a way, the original privacy statute, having been passed in 1970 to govern credit bureaus and other traffickers of data. And these traffickers of data have such a huge influence over our lives. Essentials. I mean, folks might think, okay, well, nobody really needs a credit card, and you can get by without a mortgage, but you can't get by without shelter. And so black box algorithms and companies determining your financial existence, it's not just credit, it's housing. Both credit reports and tenant screening are causing enormous harm to low and moderate income communities, enormous harm. And these are also the same companies that set the rents. If you saw ProPublica's excellent piece this past week about how RealPage, which is a tenant screening company, not only do they determine whether you can get a roof over your head, but how much you're going to pay for it, and extracts as much as possible for these corporate landlords. And then what I was asked to talk about was specifically the use of commercial surveillance by government agencies. So a couple of years ago, my colleague Sarah Mancini and I along with Justice in Aging, put out a report on how the Social Security Administration uses LexisNexis data to kick people off of supplemental security income, SSI. Now, for the lawyers in the crowd, you might think, oh, LexisNexis, the legal research tool, how can they be a bad guy?
Like, I knew they were evil from the first year of my law school. As soon as I saw that table with all the free pens they were giving away, I knew something was up.
Well, something is up, and it's worse than you think, because this is not just LexisNexis. This is the former ChoicePoint. ChoicePoint was a data broker that was slapped with a $10 million fine by the Federal Trade Commission for selling data to identity thieves in the mid-2000s. And so this is the unit that used to be ChoicePoint. And they are a data broker, and they sell data to SSA. They sell data to ICE, to law enforcement, and it gets abused in so many ways. So the report we did about LexisNexis and Social Security Administration, it's not bad enough that the SSI recipients are being surveilled. They're being surveilled incorrectly. So what is happening still is that SSA uses LexisNexis to try to find non-home real estate. What SSA is trying to do is to screen and monitor recipients to make sure they don't have too many assets or too much income. which we can debate the propriety of. But the problem is they don't do it very well, because what they were doing was tagging people with property that they didn't own based on having the same name, just the same name, and being in the same state. Because if you think about it, non-home real property is not going to be your address, right? And they weren't using any other factors, just names. So we had a case where a woman named Teresa Sims, who was in a group home for the mentally disabled, was being kicked off of SSI for owning property several counties away in Minnesota. And fortunately, legal services, she was able to be connected with legal services attorneys who were able to help her fight this. But she was not alone. And what we learned was that people of color and immigrants were especially impacted, because there's this phenomenon where people of color and immigrants happen to have often the same last name. It's called name clustering. Those of us who are immigrants and people of color, there are a lot of Woos in this country, and a lot of Sandovals. And so there's a tendency to overmatch. SSA has reformed the procedures a little bit. They're not supposed to automatically cut off people, which is what they were doing. They're supposed to actually figure out if it's the right person, but still, it's bad surveillance, more bad surveillance. SSA uses something called the work number, which is an Equifax database of payroll data. Now, at least with payroll data, you have social security numbers, so you can match more tightly. But the problem is there are still errors. We got a complaint from a consumer who she did temporary work for the census, and her travel reimbursements were being treated as overtime, and she was told she owed social security money, and that her, she was over income, and that social security was going to claw back some of her benefits. And I can spend hours talking about all the problems with credit bureaus and the errors and the inability to get them fixed. Well, those spill over to the work number too.
100%.
Yeah. And then, as I said, LexisNexis is used by ICE. And speaking of utilities, to follow up what Gabriela was talking about, ICE at one point had a contract to get data from the National Consumer Telecom and Utilities Exchange, which is a database of mostly telecom information, cable and cell phone. And what ICE was trying to do is, an immigrant, an undocumented immigrant might not have a credit card, but they'll probably have a cell phone. And that's the way they were trying. And it's been misused. Just last week, there was an article about how a police officer in Kentucky was using LexisNexis data to find women's Snapchat accounts, harvest nude pictures, and blackmail them.
Yeah.
So this
hits keep coming. Every week. How many articles? When I was preparing for this panel, I had to eventually stop collecting the articles, because as we're preparing, there's just one dystopic tale after another. I want to jump over to Brendan real quick, because as we're talking about ICE getting access to this, as we're talking about the flows between Equifax and LEOs, I think that Brendan, you're really glad you could join us to talk about police fusion centers. Can you hopefully, just to bit of background, can you explain what is a police fusion center, where they get their data, and sort of where that sits in the larger sort of flow from these data brokers and technology companies into law enforcement? And then we can talk about some of the things we've seen fusion centers do.
So the term fusion center is most strongly associated with the so-called national network of fusion centers, which are a series of 80 intelligence hubs that are recognized by the Department of Homeland Security, but operated by state and local police. They include the participation of local, state, and federal law enforcement, including, ICE, DEA, National Guard Drug Interdiction, National Office of Drug Control Policy, the HIDA program. More generally, though, I think it's useful to think of fusion centers not just as this specific program under Homeland Security, but a general model of like an interagency intelligence hub that takes information from a number of sources and brings it together for a team of analysts to work on. And if we take that general model as the example, what we see is that this is a hallmark of counterinsurgency programs, right? It's a basic arrangement that was put in place in the Cold War and even sometimes before, to manage, rebellious populations in what we now call the Global South. When we look at the United States, the first of these interagency intelligence hubs were set up in the 1970s. So the first ones are the Drug Enforcement Administration's El Paso Intelligence Center, and then the regional information sharing systems set up under the Department of Justice that are, regional information sharing consortia run by state police departments. And I think the date of the 1970s is very significant for two reasons, right? One, you have like the end of the long 1960s, and you have movements in their most radical stage, right? You have urban guerrilla movements that are, that are some of the most radical movements in U.S. history, right? The Panthers, the Young Lords, Weather Underground, etc. Right. And then you also have, the beginning of this long economic crisis that is the transition from an industrial economy to a post-industrial service economy. And what that transition meant was, growing precarity, instability, and, wage repression, wage decreases for normal people. Right. So I'm saying all this because, what fusion centers do, right, whether we're talking about the DEA original one or the post 9/11 DHS ones, despite whatever their orienting mission might be, drugs, counterterrorism, they almost exclusively focus on the crimes of the powerless, right? Conventional property and violent crimes, right? And I think when we put them in the context of of wider political economic change, what we see is this is a tool of social regulation. This is about managing the desperate violence of an increasingly created by an increasingly unequal society, right? So, what does this look like, more specifically? A lot of things that, fusion centers are like, they're places where information comes together, but they're also places where different law enforcement come together and, work on cases and develop cases. So just to give one like small example, something that's become common now is like electronic reporting requirements for pawn transactions, right? For transactions at pawn shops. And in some interagency intelligence hubs, analysts will use these databases of pawn transactions and try to reverse engineer investigative leads. Like they know who the problem burglars are, and they'll see if they've been pawning stuff, and then they'll go check on them, right? And sometimes they work very closely hand in glove with corporate retail to do things like this, right? And this is happening sometimes in the name of, in agencies stood up in the name of counterterrorism that have, sometimes, the largest fusion centers, DHS fusion centers will have 100 personnel, a budget of $10 million. These are not insignificant operations. And what are they focusing on? They're focusing on, a lot of times petty property crimes, drug crimes, things that
I don't want to tee something up for you, but did you write a little bit about the use of fusion centers to surveil protesters recently?
Right. So fusion centers have monitored every major social movement in the past 20 years, and not just those on the left, right? Some of the first actually opposition to fusion centers came from an organization called Operation Diffuse, which grew out of the Ron Paul presidential campaign, because they were, libertarians and, militia movement and anti, patriot stuff were monitored by fusion centers. Usually most of the Fusion Center monitoring is just, surveillance, entering information in databases. There's not a lot of evidence of COINTELPRO style, like really aggressive infiltration and counter subversion, right? But that
It's
is
just
because
living in the panopticon.
right, but there's a reason for that. Fusion centers are not operational entities, right? They're information clearinghouses, and they generate information that then is used by other agencies, right? And this kind of this makes them kind of more permeable to outside influences, right? So in the case of Standing Rock, right, corporate security for Energy Transfer Partners, the contractor they hired, they came in and basically operated through Fusion Center networks and took information from Fusion Centers and gave information to Fusion Centers, and in some ways captured the Fusion Center for their corporate pacification project. And other times, Fusion Centers can be constrained to a degree by local politics, right? So if we look at the crackdown on the Occupy movement, right, some occupations were aggressively cracked down, and again, different interests seized hold of Fusion Center networks. Other Occupy encampments avoided that, right? And there wasn't the uniform aggressiveness we saw in the 1960s with the FBI's COINTELPRO program, right? But this itself actually is kind of harder to deal with, because like it's a degree of plausible deniability like baked in to the decentralized like bureaucratic structure of Fusion Centers, right? And another thing that's really important about Fusion Centers that's different than like mid 20th century surveillance, which shapes a lot of our ideas, is the role of the private sector, right? The private sector is huge in Fusion Centers. They're all over Fusion Centers, both as partners and as contractors, right? And in this way, it kind of is almost reminiscent to the late 19th century, where you had like private armies of anti-union spies and thugs, right? One of the big exposés on Standing Rock, published in The Intercept, written by Aileen Brown and Alice Sperry and Will Parrish, called them 21st century Pinkertons, right?
Mitra, can we talk a little bit about one of the projects that Upturn has worked on, and I think overlaps like completely with this discussion, where there's the Fusion Centers that are the hubs of where that information is combined, but Upturn has worked on the point of collection. Can you talk about the mass extraction project, the report that you guys have recently published?
Yes, definitely. So hi, everyone. My name is Mitra Ebadolahi. I use she, her pronouns. And I work at Upturn, which is a DC-based organization, although I myself am mostly in San Diego. And Upturn, for those who aren't familiar with our work, we believe that technology should advance justice rather than amplify racial and economic inequities, which it often does. So we work across disciplines with computer science, quantitative, legal, and policy analysis to try to lift up the most pressing civil rights challenges that are part of technology in our modern world. So our mass extraction report it's an October 2020 report that was published about the ways in which law enforcement agencies across the country are searching cell phones, typically, although not always, incident to arrest. And how to search those phones, law enforcement agencies use mobile device forensic tools, MDFTs. Those mobile device forensic tools are basically a really powerful extractive technology. And they allow police to take a full copy of data from a cell phone, all emails, all texts, all photos, all location and other app data, and I'm sure much more, which can then be programmatically searched. And as one expert has put it, with the amount of sensitive information and just personal information that we store on our phones today, those tools, those mobile device forensic tools, basically provide a window into one's soul.
I love that
And-
framing. I was listening to someone just yesterday at an ACLU event that framed that as the same way of saying that what we need to conceptualize these things as are thoughts, when you're thinking at, search
Totally.
history, when you're thinking about notes that you put into your phone to remind yourself, like that is taking a thought and making it manifest. And then suddenly that can be used against you.
Absolutely. And, I think that that is bad enough, but a few facts make that even worse or even more distressing for people who care about privacy and also for people who care about racial justice. So in 2011, only about 35% of Americans owned a smartphone. By October 2020, when the report came out, it was at least 81%. And that number has probably gone up further in the intervening almost 2 years. And this is really important, many Americans, and especially people of color and people with lower incomes, rely solely on their cell phones to connect to the internet. And so it's not just that you have a situation where law enforcement is extracting this massive quantity of highly personal information from someone's personal electronic device, but also that the ways in which those kinds of devices are used aren't necessarily the same across different kinds of communities, such that low-income communities and communities of color actually potentially have a greater risk of a privacy intrusion. There might be more that law enforcement is able to extract from the cell phones, especially the smartphones of folks in those groups.
Right.
And yeah, so methodologically, the way that report was created was a massive number of public records requests to state and local law enforcement agencies across the country. And that through those requests, we were able to get documents about more than 2,000 agencies that had purchased these mobile device forensic tools in all 50 states and in DC. And that especially since 2015, a lot of these searches have been conducted without a warrant, maybe incident to an arrest, although there's also this very pernicious trend of so-called consent searches where under various contexts, law enforcement will basically ask someone to consent to the search of their device. And as we know, there is an inherent coerciveness in interactions with law enforcement that render the concept of consent in that context extremely fraught and potentially nonsensical. So that's one example of the kind of work that Upturn has done. And all of that predates my time with the organization. I just joined Upturn in May of this year. And so very briefly, I would just add a couple of points from my previous life as a border litigator, focusing on the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection in particular. I think that in addition to both the local law enforcement and the kind of fusion center, local federal collaborations, there's an enormous and very distressing way in which surveillance technology in particular is used to deepen the militarization of our borders and to expand immigration enforcement more generally. Again, these are communities that are not even, they are disproportionately affected by some of these privacy incursions that we should all be worried about. And I think one of the things that's really distressing is the extent to which it seems like it's increasingly politically palatable for elected officials to promote tech-driven alternatives to—
Why have a border wall when we have a digital border wall? It's
That's
okay
right.
because the Biden administration is proposing it.
That's right. And that's the alternative to the more overtly xenophobic Stephen Miller policies of the physical wall.
Right.
But that digital border wall, the use of drones, sensors, the expansion of mass surveillance technologies throughout the border region, not at just the physical boundary of the United States, but well into the interior of the United States, really does cause long-term harm to communities of color and immigrants and low-income folks. You also see that not just with the border wall, but also with the so-called alternatives to detention, where millions of immigrants are now subject to ankle monitoring. The amazing work of Just Futures Law, which I plug every time I get a chance. They just recently did an incredible report about the human costs of ankle monitors and the ways in which ankle monitors impede people's ability to show up to work, to take their kids to socialize at birthday parties. There's like a wide range of things that I think we just don't realize. And so what you end up having, and I think this is really important for privacy advocates to be mindful of, is a reality where some communities are policed in overlapping ways. And each layer of that policing, each layer of that digital surveillance or that use of technology is itself very damaging. And then together you have a compounding effect where really I think we live in such an unequal society that at this point, people who are experiencing those kinds of environments are experiencing privacy or the lack of privacy in a way that's completely at odds with what is promised in our Constitution and, you know, in the public discourse about privacy.
That is, put it on a bumper sticker. That is exactly it. We have a couple questions coming in from the audience. And so this just completely feeds into a question that I wanted to ask Mitra. And I guess Gabriela over at Turn as well. You know, there's been some enormous successes in San Diego, at least in recent years, pushing back against, for example, smart city infrastructure baked into, yes, I use smart city with the biggest air quotes, listeners. My eyes are practically rolling out of my head as I say it. But we have pushed back against, for example, smart city infrastructure with smart light poles that we were found to have been deployed extremely unequally. Obviously, I spoke earlier about the phenomena that Chula Vista became the most surveilled city in the country. We have a question from one of the audience members that says, what are advocates doing in California or in states elsewhere to rein in private companies within the use of utility customer information or the perpetuation of digital poorhouses? And to my question, I think that feeds into this, I was hoping that you two could speak about that success or speak about the successes that we have seen and how that played out. What was different about that we haven't seen everywhere? And I guess more broadly, as advocates and organizations are trying to push back, what is missing in that resistance, and what should we make sure to do if we want to succeed? No biggie, just a small little question. Just
yeah, so I will keep my comments on this brief. I think that what happened in Chula Vista was both extremely inspiring and also a cautionary tale. I think that the idea of, for instance, having a vetting council or, sort of like I'm blanking on what the official name for it is. But, effectively a group of people who are specifically charged with providing the city council with advice about potential technological adoptions. I think that one of the things, and I genuinely do not have the answer for this problem, this is just something I think about a lot.
Right.
How do we participate in spaces and systems where these decisions get made, which I think is absolutely essential, without having our participation provide an imprint of consent or everything's fine. Yeah, that's right. Well, sometimes the very fact that, a civil rights advocate was on the committee, and then the committee, ultimately made a recommendation, which the council may or may not even go with.
We had a multi-stakeholder session. I don't understand what you...
Right, exactly. That can be very... it's weird. It's almost worse than a situation where you don't even have the proverbial seat at the table, because I think what happens is that level of nominal participation diffuses organizing. It diffuses community energy. It diffuses the rage and like the concern. And I think that our opponents know that. And so I don't have answers. I'm not as in the weeds on this particular issue, although I tried my best to keep up with it as a San Diegan. But that's sort of my top line reaction, is just how are we wary of being co-opted when really I think most of us, as speaking for myself certainly, prefer a more abolitionist frame. Right. So how do we achieve that? What does that actually look like?
I want to open that up to the rest of the panels as well. I think Brendan might have some thoughts on there. Chichi, Xavid, if you have any thoughts, but first to Gabriela.
So I think, the win against NTCUE that Chichi mentioned earlier, as well as our own internal wins here in California, I think we need to hold on to the times where we're able to make these wins, right? I mean, I think in California, it was a big deal to be able to say, okay, ICE, you're issuing these internal subpoenas and we're going to close this loophole. And, working with partners like Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, like ACLU San Diego, we were able to build up just the right kind of group of allies and build the right kind of pressure among decision makers. I think it was very fortuitous for us to have Todd Gloria be the author of the legislation. Similarly, Turn is often finds ourselves at odds with the utility companies. But in this particular situation, the utility companies were also invested in the privacy of their customers, right? And so we were able to create this, what might have seemed to some folks as an unlikely alliance between Turn and the utility companies in order to protect customer data. This work to protect smart meter data is also closely linked to our work at Turn to protect smartphone data. And as part of the work we've done with that, we were able to get the California Privacy Protection Act passed a few years ago. It's imperfect in many, many ways, right? But I think given, and I loved what you said, Mitra, about about the constitutional rights, and it got me thinking about what are the rights that we as a kind of as a larger national entity hold dear to, or what some subsets hold on to, and what are the ones that we've somehow just given up, right? I think we have whole generations of young people who assume there is no reason to think that anything is private, and we've so many parts of our communities have thrown up our hands. We don't read disclosures. We don't read about privacy. We don't, we're bombarded. We've been worn down to this point where we've given up so many of our privacy rights. All the more reason, I think, that we need to celebrate the wins that we have and continue to work to make it to address these issues in a meaningful way.
Chichi, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say, as much as folks in California might be pessimistic or might think, oh God, how do we deal with this? You guys really have led the forefront in consumer protection and privacy. I mean, the California Consumer Privacy Act is a pretty remarkable achievement. The Fair Credit Reporting Act that I talked about is 50 years old. I think the act, and definitely the amendments, all stemmed from California laws that were passed before the federal legislation was passed. So you guys have really led that. And so that's super important. Yes, all of that is imperfect, but don't give up. No pressure, but we're all looking to you and your legislature.
To that end, I might suggest that you not support federal proposals that purport to preempt California privacy laws.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I'm just throwing that out there. Maybe if there's a federal privacy law that preempts California law, maybe not a good idea to trust all of privacy legislation to Congress in 2022.
Absolutely. The two swords that the two issues that we really try to fight hard on are preemption and private remedies, because
absolutely, yes.
I'm glad you're excited about private remedies, because that's super important. A law without an enforcement mechanism sometimes might not as well exist. And then, to Mitra's point, I mean, as a consumer advocate, we struggle with this constantly. members of industry asking us to be on this committee and that board. First of all, who has all the time to do that? And second, yeah, are you being co-opted? But on the other hand, do need the ears of people in industry, because sometimes what they're doing, they need to be brought along, or sometimes you might have some influence. So it is really tricky. But echoing Gabriela's point, we can't give up. We have to hold on to the victories, and we have to keep trying. Been doing this for 20 years.
Absolutely. The fight goes on. I've got another question about what everyone's sort of ideal legislative solution, if we could try to hit one area, but I wanted also to leave space for Xavid and Brendan to respond to that question earlier on, maintaining, maintaining the fight.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think a lot of it is really finding ways to sort of maintain hope. I think it's sort of easy sometimes for people to feel like, these big, big tech companies or these big organizations, like, they're just too big to really for activists, acting to oppose. But like, I think it's good to keep in mind, this isn't the way it's always been. There isn't this like, inexorable guarantee that things are going to keep moving in the same direction. And I think there's a lot of avenues for organizing to fight this. So I sort of think it's just really important to be able to sort of visualize a better place and then find like-minded people and work together with them. And I think, sort of like the technology's changed a lot, and there's definitely a lot of issues with people sort of being willing to trade away their privacy to be a part of social networks, to be able to take some of the, to get some of the benefits of technology, or to, do things that they want to do. But I think there's also a lot of people like, people here and people elsewhere who are, fighting to create alternatives. And I think, just because, big organizations are, financially incentivized to make it act like, this is the only way, I think, there are all alternatives, and we can work together to, both, put restrictions and improve what these large companies are doing, and then also, create alternatives so that, it's not like everyone has to be a part of these things that do involve some real trade-offs.
Brendan?
So I have, a comment that I think will kind of respond to both questions. And like, first, I'll just say, like, I think, for me, in terms of legislative action, the most important thing to do is to, shut down, shut down places that do government surveillance, right? And limit the flow of information to those places, right? So in Maine, as a result of a whistleblower complaint and then a massive leak of classified information happening in 2020, when like the George Floyd rebellion was hot and heavy, like it created a political window for us to, put forward a defund bill to shut down the fusion center. And it got through the House, the state House, but not the state Senate. And now we're talking, well, what can we do to follow up? Like the straight defund failed. We don't want to legitimize this, unnecessary and harmful surveillance center by, improving its privacy policy, right? So what can we do? We want to try to, approach a death by 1,000 cuts, right? So we're interested in, the Biometric Privacy Act from Illinois, which regulates the collection of biometric data. We're talking
just
about,
to throw that out there, PRC pushed a version of Illinois BIPA here in California last year. It saw some success. We plan to reintroduce the bill this year as well. Sorry,
right?
but yes.
Oh, no problem. No, it's great. We're thinking about how to regulate, private data brokers and how to limit the police use of them. So these are the things we're talking about. But, for me, I take the challenge of abolition very seriously, and abolition is more than, dismantling dismantling, sources of structural violence, right? So in Abolition Democracy, Angela Davis talks about, the positive task of abolition. And I think, when we think about what that means for surveillance abolition, we really need to get to the root of the problem, right? Surveillance isn't about technology, right? It's about a basic relation, and it's very old. So in 17th century Europe, that was the first time that the new science of statistics was applied to the problems of government. Like life was redefined as information, and the body became an information technology. And this created an opportunity for individuals to be policed through the information that institutions produced about them, usually without their consent or control or knowledge, right? So this is like the basic thing that we need to obliterate, not just like abolish, but replace. So I think thinking about surveillance abolition raises a much more challenging question than privacy protection and rolling back like all the terrible things the government and private sector do. Right? How should we produce, share, and use information outside of surveillance and control? So that's a question that has never been posed to the public and has been answered behind our backs by the corporate spooks and security ghouls that want to control their lives. But I think there's some useful examples to think about that we don't always think about when we think about privacy, right? So one thing that I think is very interesting, the workplace is a big site of surveillance, right? And everyone who's worked knows that in different ways. Many cooperative businesses use a system called open books accounting, right? Where if you're going to run cooperative businesses, the finances of the business need to be plain to everyone, right? And this is a basic paradigm shift that moves the creation and dissemination of information within a business from worker control. It's about labor productivity and reaching certain standards to a kind of democratic, a more democratic form of legibility. Now everyone, all the employees, all the members of the co-op know the business's finance, and you can make informed decisions together, right? And I would point to free and open software movement, the consensus model of decision making used by grassroots organizations as other seeds for different types of seeds of what we might call democratic legibility, right? Different ways of producing and sharing information. So I just want to throw this out here as an idea for rising to the positive task of surveillance abolition and accepting the challenge of trying to build a world where information and knowledge are delinked from capitalist exploitation and state control, right? Because I think a lot of times we focus so much on legal and legislative strategies to roll back, whatever, fusion centers. That's so much time of my life on that, right? And that's important work and I always support it. But, I think there's this other huge question that's been very neglected. And it's one that we can start right now in our own organizations, right? In our own, we can start on the grassroots. You can start from the bottom up by, not just acting differently as individuals, but by, fighting within our institutions for different ways of, management.
That's a great answer. I love the shift of focus too. Gabrielle, I also want to call out an excellent question in the chat that you have already responded to in text, but I wanted to provide hourly for the rest of the listeners and attendees. But Gabriela mentioned how for the ICE-related law, utility companies were on board. George Parampathy says that this reminds him of how big tech was on board for Cal ECBA because they did not want to waste money or resources cooperating with every law enforcement request. By the way, we saw the similar just this past year with the LADOT and Uber surprisingly pushing back against calls from the LADOT to get access to all mobility rental services. But his question is a great one, which is, how do we stop the companies themselves from surveilling for profit, or what coalition would have the political power to limit the companies most directly? And Gabriela, since you gave a response, I'm going to let you opine on that.
Sure, yeah. And so what I said is that this is truly an important question. And I'm sure that if, the investor-owned utilities were being offered, and let me just differentiate here, because if something costs them money, they aren't necessarily unwilling to participate in infringing upon privacy rights, because all of their money comes from us, right? It comes from ratepayers. And so, but let's say their shareholders were poised to make a profit off of infringing on people's privacy rights, that, we might have fallen on a completely different side of that argument. But this is precisely why, at least in the utility space, regulation, strong consumer-focused regulation is so critically important, right? So in California, we have the California Public Utilities Commission to help us fight that fight had it, come up.
Yeah, and I guess I should add, the little addendum I threw in there about Uber actually reaching out to privacy organizations to oppose this bill that would have given LADOT access to all of that precise location information, perhaps should be viewed in a different light, given Uber's announcement in the past week that they are now going to become a data broker selling location information. And so,
always follow the money.
Always.
Follow.
Qui bono.
And that's why the third-party data brokers, both whether or not they're covered by the Fair Credit Reporting Act or not, are so problematic, because they make money from trafficking in the data, and we have no control. With a utility company, at least you're still their customer. If folks remember from the 2017 Equifax data breach, finally the concept that we are not the customers of a credit bureau or a tenant screening company or a LexisNexis. We are the commodity.
A little bit of research that PRC is doing on that front. So there are 2 laws in the country that require data brokers to register with the state. There's one in California and one in Vermont. We have, over the past 3 or 4 years now, annually scraped both of those lists and then done some analysis on the actual data brokers that have reported and their privacy policies. There's some excellent research last year, but we're looking at the order of just over or just under 600 data brokers that have registered between the Vermont and the California offices. Of course, if you talk to like the MarTech companies, there's some MarTech advocates and sellers out there that say that the average number of MarTech firms in the U.S. may be as high as 10,000, and so where's the line there? But yeah, I mean, in PRC, data brokers are absolutely an area where we think would be a key if we are trying to, and getting to my question of, and I want to go around the board that says, in an ideal world with one piece of legislation, one piece of policy change, what do you think would be doing the most substantial change? Yeah, it's a very tough question. I don't necessarily have an answer to, but I think that Chi-Chi, you've absolutely hit on it, which is we've got to deal with the data broker elephant in the room. This entire, and whether that's through data minimization, like actual data minimization requirements, whether that's changing to an opt-in framework as opposed to opt-out, or whether it's specifically sector-specific regulation around data brokers, or as Brendan says, abolition of data brokers. And I think that all of those are arguments that we should be exploring. But Chi-Chi, since you're still unmuted, I'll jump it right back to you.
Okay. Put me on the spot first.
Well, if you want to pass, that's fair.
No. I don't have great answers to what's the perfect regulatory scheme. I do know a few things, which is the current privacy bill out there, the so-called bipartisan one, has some really big pitfalls.
Mm-hmm.
For example, one is it excludes anything not only regulated by the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which is the weakest of consumer protection laws ever. That's the one responsible for all the privacy policies that no one reads. I mean, a scheme that involves consumers reading page after page, or even 2 pages of text and then figuring out how to opt out is not going to work. We always favor opt-in, but even opt-in is tricky, because how do you do the opt-in? And opt-in could be click wrap. You don't want that, right? How do you make sure it's meaningful, robust, affirmative opt-in with knowledge? And then even then, we might be able to navigate that, but think about a single mom with 2 jobs. Do you expect her to really be able to manage the control of her data? Right?
Yeah.
No, she's too busy surviving. So I don't have the perfect answer. I know that there's a lot of stuff out there that's not great. The bipartisan privacy bill also preempts California law, and has some traps in its private remedies that are very limited. So all I can say is what's not a good idea to do, unfortunately. I mean, the Fair Credit Reporting Act does set forth some fair information principles that are useful, like disclosure, knowing what a company has about you, notices when the information is used against you, accuracy, and the ability to dispute inaccuracies are all really important. So that's part of a framework that should be in there, because a lot of the stuff we deal with isn't even control. It's like, you got it wrong and you're messing with my life.
100%. Yep. And then you try to call their support and there's no number, no human on the other side. Gabriela? Oh, did you already answer that question? Sorry, excuse me. Mitra.
Yeah, I don't know. It's it's an important question, but I think I've been spending more time lately not thinking about legislation and trying to think about like shifting power.
Reach. Oh,
I think
yeah.
that, not that those are mutually exclusive things. I mean, you can't disengage from the world and from the existing power structures, but I think to Brendan's point, it's just something I struggle with as someone who, for example, is trained as an attorney. That's an inside game framework where you're participating in the existing system in an effort to change it, and there are limits to that.
I've got very good friends that went to work at Meta thinking they're going to change it. I'm sorry, I'm going to tell you, you're not going to change Meta. You're not.
Right. And I think the sort of the theme that's emerging, one of the themes is, I think that there are a lot of people who want an alternative, and it's very hard to articulate what that is when you are enmeshed in these interlocking systems. And sort of to Chi-Chi's point, like, how did it get to a place where our data is being weaponized against us so effectively before we even realized it? I'm constantly thinking about the sort of parable of the frog being boiled alive.
It did get markedly worse just in the past 5 years, it feels like.
Yes, I think that's
things
right.
have gotten much worse, very, very quickly.
Yeah, it's really, it does feel exponential. So,
yeah.
I think that, I think about one of the things that I think happens sometimes with tech is we focus on algorithms or these very technical issues. But data brokers, for example, aren't really necessarily getting where they are because of like some fancy technology. They're just filtering all of the existing criminal records reports, eviction records reports, credit record reports that are already out there and packaging them and selling them on. And so I think, I'm sorry, this is a little bit of an abstract answer, but I think what I'm thinking about is how do we make these problems less technical? How do we make them more comprehensible? And how do we identify the intersectionalities that permeate throughout so that we can actually build power outside of our silos, irrespective of whether we're technologists? And maybe that translates into legislation, right? But what else? And then what else? So that's, I don't know.
Perfect answer, frankly. Like goosebumps. The camera's cutting it off. I mean, that's exactly it. Xavid, I want to give you a chance to respond, but also I think we're ready to wrap this up as well. Do you have a piece of legislation, that you think would do the most good in the smallest package?
Yeah, that's obviously a complicated question. I want to briefly agree with what Mitra is saying, like often people sort of point to algorithms almost as like scapegoats or like sort of, you know, money laundering for ethics or something. It's like, it's not me who's making a biased decision. This algorithm is making the biased decision. And like, you know, often the you know, almost always the problem is not really with the algorithm or us needing to develop better algorithms and the corporations, you know, pursuing profit. And it's just a scapegoat. I mean, you've got examples like police departments using an algorithm configured to always say to deny parole or something.
Yeah.
We're not giving them a fair shot because we're just doing what the algorithm says. It's just, I think it's a hard problem. I think to some extent, when we've got corporations, operating on this scale, it's going to take a massive effort between sort of governmental regulation and activism to be able to, deal with the scale. I mean, I think from my bias perspective, I think a lot of what I really think would be valuable is more meaningful protections for workers with ethical concerns, workers who face retaliation, so they can see, like, if a corporation isn't complying with regulation or is just doing something unethical, even if it's not forbidden by law, opportunities for that to get out there without that worker potentially both losing their job and like maybe losing future employability in their field and so on. Like the consequences that workers can face for organizing or whistleblowing are quite large. And today the remedies that workers have when they face retaliation or when they lose their jobs for these sorts of things, the remedies aren't enough to really to address the risks that they face. And so I think we need to sort of create meaningful protections so that misconduct, unethical behavior, illegal behavior is something that's more likely to come to light, even when, especially when it's either like a large corporation or one of these sort of shadowy corporations that people aren't aware of is doing it. I think that's, it's not obviously not going to be a total solution, but I think it's an important part of rebalancing some of this power away from, the sort of the boards and the executives at these corporations.
I think that's a great focus on labor there. One of the things I want to point out that I think is an enormous sort of privacy elephant in the room issue that is not getting enough press, but is, I'm not sure how much folks are here are aware of, but the CPRA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, before it, when it was passed, unintentionally covered employees and employers to the same extent that it covered consumers and businesses. This was one of the things that was very quickly amended out in the months following the passage of AB 375 in 2019. And the instrument by which that excising was done is very simply a sort of kick the can down the road exemption, which sunsetted first in 2021 and then in 2023. That sunset is about to expire, meaning that in January of this year, every California employee will have the same rights with regards to their employer as a consumer does to a business that has their personal information. I am fascinated when we start talking about capital P power, right? I am really interested in, I think that legislatively, this was a fluke, perhaps, that this did not get patched out in this legislative session. There certainly were multiple attempts to, but the long and the short of it is that come January, employees across California will be able to make CCPA requests to their employers. And I think that's absolutely fascinating and a tidal shift when it comes to the relationship that workers have with regard to the privacy law. So not to get that last word in edgewise, but we are just about at time. So that is unfortunately all the time we have today, but I hope that everyone in attendance, all of our panelists, had as much fun as I did, which was a lot of fun if it wasn't obvious. Again, if you're interested in receiving a follow-up two-pager that sort of covers and summarizes some of the stuff we've talked about today, we'll be circulating one to everyone that registered with their email address. But also, if you did not do so, if you want that information, please reach out to me, reach out to Catalina Sanchez, reach out to John Ying in the chat. My email address is emory@privacyrights.org, EMORY@privacyrights.org, and we'll be happy to send that your way. And I also want to make a shout out that if you found this discussion interesting, if you did at all, I would really encourage you to join us again in just 2 weeks. We're going to be holding a very similarly formatted panel, but focusing on reproductive privacy and reproductive justice in a post-Dobbs world. Panelists will speak on the issues specifically impacting LGBTQIA+ communities, talk about the ways that consumer technology is betraying women in crisis, and we'll speak to people that are actually on the ground serving women's organizations that are desperately trying to get health care. I sincerely hope to see some or all of you there, but this has been an absolute pleasure. I hope that we'll see you again in the future. Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists, especially Gabriela, Brendan, Xavid, Mitra, Chichi. Thank you. You guys are amazing.